What would you have done if this was your house? Not as a viewer, not from a distance, but inside it, living it, waking up to it every day. Because it's easy to judge a story when you only see the outcome. It's harder when you imagine yourself standing in the middle of it, with no clear instructions, no support system, and no way to pause what's already unfolding. This is not just the story of a family. It's the story of a man placed in a role that sounds simple, until you understand what that role actually required. Larry Whittaker was not born into control. He was born into a structure already under strain. A house where responsibility wasn't optional. It was constant. A house where care wasn't temporary. It was permanent. A house where some people could not protect themselves, and others had to carry that weight without training, without backup, without relief. That's where the story begins. Not with failure, but with inheritance. Because Larry didn't step into a stable situation and lose it. He stepped into something fragile and tried to hold it together. Now think about what that really means. A home where routines are not structured by systems, but by survival. Where care is not scheduled, but improvised. Where communication is not always clear, and needs are not always expressed in ways outsiders would recognize. That kind of environment doesn't run on rules. It runs on familiarity. People knowing each other, reading signals, understanding patterns that don't translate outside the house. And in that world, Larry was one of the few who could cross the boundary. He could speak to outsiders. He could interact with systems. He could explain, at least partially, what was happening inside. That made him important. But it also made him responsible. Not for everything, but for something specific. The boundary, the line between inside and outside. Because as long as that line held, the house remained its own world. Imperfect, strained, but contained. And for a long time, that line did hold. Not perfectly, but effectively enough. Outsiders didn't come freely. Curiosity stayed at a distance. The family remained largely unseen, and in a way, that invisibility acted as protection. Not ideal protection, but real, because once something is unseen, it cannot be consumed. Now here's where the story begins to shift, because one day, that boundary changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough. A camera arrives. A visitor stays longer. A conversation opens the door just a little wider than before. And at first, nothing seems wrong. Because the first contact doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like attention. And attention, especially after years of isolation, can feel like relief. Someone is listening. Someone is noticing. Someone is offering something different. And that's where the decision becomes complicated. Because turning that away isn't easy. Not when you've spent years without help. Not when the house needs things. Not when people inside need support you can't fully provide. So the door opens. Just enough. And that's where Larry's role becomes critical. Because once the door opens, someone has to decide how far it stays open. Who comes in, what they bring, what they take, and most importantly, what they are allowed to do. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. That kind of control requires something specific. Not kindness, not patience, authority, the ability to say no, the willingness to enforce it, even when it costs something, even when it turns help away, even when it creates conflict. Because without that, boundaries don't hold. They shift, gradually, until they are no longer boundaries at all. And that's where things begin to change. Not in a single moment, but in small permissions. A visit becomes routine. A camera becomes normal. A conversation becomes content. And slowly, the house stops being just a home. It becomes something else. A place that can be entered, observed, interpreted. And once that happens, control starts to move. Away from the people inside, to the people watching. Now ask yourself this. At what point does help stop being help? Is it when money is involved? Is it when attention grows? Is it when the story starts being told by someone else? Or is it earlier, when the line between private life and public view first disappears? Because that's the moment Larry was standing in, not as an outsider, but as the one person expected to manage it. And that expectation is where the weight of this story sits. Because the world doesn't judge complexity. It simplifies. It looks for a figure, a role, a person to hold accountable. And in this case, that person became Larry. Not because he created the situation, but because he was positioned at the point where it could have been contained. And wasn't. Now fairness matters. Because this is not the story of a man with resources who ignored responsibility. This is the story of a man with limited control, facing something he may not have fully understood. But lack of understanding does not stop consequences. Because once the boundary breaks, it doesn't break halfway. It changes everything. The house is no longer private. The family is no longer unseen. And the story is no longer theirs alone. And from that moment on, everything that enters stays. Attention, money, opinions, people, all moving through the same space, all interacting with the same vulnerability. And here's the part that matters most. Once that process starts, it is very hard to reverse. Because closing the door becomes harder than opening it. Saying no becomes harder than saying yes. And regaining control becomes harder than losing it. That's the point where this stops being about a single decision and becomes about a pattern of access, a pattern of exposure, a pattern that slowly reshapes the entire environment. And Larry, whether he intended it or not, was part of that pattern, not the cause, but the point of entry. And that's why this story doesn't ask a simple question. It asks a difficult one. Not what happened, but what should have been stopped before it ever reached that point. Comment below. If you were in Larry's position, would you have closed the door early, even if it meant turning away help? The hardest part of this story isn't identifying when things went wrong. It's recognizing how normal it all looked while it was happening. Because collapse doesn't announce itself. It blends in. It disguises itself as progress, as help, as opportunity. And that's exactly what makes it dangerous. At first, nothing feels out of place. Someone shows up with good intentions. They talk. They listen. They bring something the house didn't have before. Attention. And attention, in a place that has been ignored for years, doesn't feel like a threat. It feels like relief. Because finally, someone is paying attention to what's happening inside. Finally, someone sees the struggle. Finally, something might change. So the door stays open. Not fully, but enough. Then something else arrives. Not just attention, but benefit. A ride somewhere. Food. Clothes. A small improvement. Something tangible. And now the situation becomes more complicated. Because it's no longer just observation. It's exchange. Something is being given. And when something is given, it becomes harder to say no. Because turning it away feels like losing something you didn't have before. And that's where the shift begins. Slowly, almost invisibly. Because the people coming in are no longer just visitors. They become part of the environment. Part of the routine. Part of the system. And once someone becomes part of the system, removing them becomes difficult. Because now they're connected. To the house. To the people. To the story. And this is where Larry's role becomes even more critical. Because now it's not about opening the door. It's about managing what came through it. Who stays? Who leaves? Who is trusted? Who is limited? And that requires judgment. Consistent judgment. Not once, but repeatedly. Over time. Now here's where things begin to blur. Because when help and presence become linked, boundaries get harder to define. If someone brings support, are they allowed more access? If someone contributes, do they earn trust? If someone says they care, should they be believed? These are not simple questions, especially in an environment where needs are real, where resources are limited, where every bit of help feels significant. And that's exactly why this stage is so fragile, because the system inside the house is no longer closed. It's interacting with something external, something unpredictable, and unpredictability introduces risk. Not immediately, but gradually. Now consider what happens when money enters the picture. Not large amounts at first. Small flows, donations, offers, support tied to visibility. And suddenly, something changes. The situation is no longer just about care. It's about value. Not moral value. Market value. Because now the story has weight. People are watching. People are reacting. People are contributing. And that creates something new. An incentive. Not necessarily intentional, but real. The more visible the situation becomes, the more attention it attracts. The more attention it attracts, the more support it can generate. And that creates a loop. Visibility brings attention. Attention brings resources. Resources encourage more visibility. And once that loop starts, it's hard to stop. Because stopping it means giving something up. Support, attention, opportunity. And in a place where those things are scarce, letting them go is not easy. Now think about this from Larry's position. He is not managing a controlled system. He is managing something evolving, something growing, something he may not fully understand. And every decision becomes more complex. Do you limit access and lose support? Or allow access and risk exposure? Do you trust people offering help? Or question them and risk losing what they bring? Do you step back and observe? Or step in and control something you may not be equipped to manage? These are not clean choices. They are trade-offs. And over time, those trade-offs begin to accumulate. Small allowances become patterns. Patterns become habits. And habits become the new normal. Now here's the turning point. Because at some stage, the balance shifts. Help is no longer just help. It becomes influence. The people entering the house are no longer just supporting. They are shaping the environment, shaping the narrative, shaping how the family is seen. And that's where control begins to move. Away from the inside, toward the outside. Because once others begin telling the story, the family no longer fully owns it. And once the story is no longer fully owned, decisions begin to follow that shift. Not directly, but indirectly. Through presence, through suggestion, through repetition. And Larry, standing in the middle of this, is now dealing with something entirely different from what he started with. Not just a household, but a system influenced by outside forces. And this is where weakness in protection becomes visible. Not because of a single mistake, but because of what isn't stopped. Because once the environment becomes influenced by external actors, someone has to reassert control. Set limits. Define boundaries. Restrict access. And that requires something difficult. Saying no to people who appear helpful. Questioning people who seem supportive. And potentially losing resources in order to maintain structure. Now ask yourself, how often does that actually happen in situations like this? When help is tied to access. When support is tied to visibility. When attention brings resources. How easy is it to close that door again? It's not. And that's where the system begins to drift. Not collapse. Drift. Away from control. Away from stability. Towards something less predictable. And this drift doesn't look dramatic. It looks normal. People coming and going. Conversations happening. Money moving. Attention increasing. From the outside, it can even look like improvement. Because more is happening. More interaction. More visibility. More engagement. But underneath that, something else is changing. The structure is weakening. Because consistency is being replaced by variability. And variability in a system that depends on stability, creates stress. Now think about the individuals inside that environment. They are not processing this in the same way outsiders do. They are responding to changes, to new people, to shifting routines. And those responses are signals. Signals that something is different. But without clear communication, those signals are often misunderstood or overlooked. And that's where the real risk begins to grow. Not from one event, but from accumulated change. Now return to Larry. At this point, he is no longer just maintaining a household. He is standing inside a system that has expanded beyond its original boundaries. A system with external influence, with internal strain, with increasing complexity. And the question becomes, can he still control it? Or has control already begun to slip? Because once control slips past a certain point, it becomes difficult to regain. Not impossible, but difficult. And that difficulty increases over time. Because the longer a system operates in a new pattern, the more that pattern solidifies. Until one day, it's no longer a shift. It's the reality. And by then, reversing it requires more than awareness. It requires intervention. And that's exactly where this story is heading. Not toward a sudden collapse, but toward a system that has drifted far enough from stability that something else has to step in. And when that happens, it doesn't ask whether the process was intentional. It asks whether the outcome is safe. And if the answer is no, everything changes. Comment below. At what point do you think help becomes control? And should that line be drawn earlier than most people realize? By the time the situation reached its breaking point, the most important shift had already happened. The house was no longer in control of itself. That doesn't mean chaos in the dramatic sense. It means something quieter, more dangerous. The loss of authority. Not the kind written on paper, but the kind that holds a system together. Because once a household loses the ability to regulate who enters, who influences, who decides, and who benefits, it stops functioning as a protected space. It becomes open. And openness, without structure, invites something predictable. Interference. Not always malicious, not always obvious, but constant. And over time, that constant presence changes everything inside. Now think about what that means in practice. People moving through the same rooms. Different voices, different intentions, different levels of understanding. Some offering help, some offering attention, some offering nothing at all except observation. And all of it happening in a space that was never built to handle it. That's where the system begins to fracture. Not because it collapses, but because it loses consistency. And consistency is the foundation of care in a house like this. Now consider the effect of that fracture. Decisions become unclear. Responsibilities become blurred. No one is fully in charge, but everyone is involved. And that's one of the most unstable positions a system can reach. Because without clear authority, boundaries dissolve. And when boundaries dissolve, vulnerability increases. Now this is where the story becomes harder to look at directly. Because it's not about one person doing something wrong. It's about what wasn't stopped, what wasn't limited, what wasn't controlled. And in a situation like this, what isn't controlled becomes what defines it. Now at the presence of money, not structured, not managed, moving through conversations, through relationships, through assumptions, money tied to attention, attention tied to access, access tied to influence. That combination creates pressure, not always visible, but always present. Because now decisions are no longer just about care. They're about resources, about who controls them, about how they move. And in a system without clear structure, that movement becomes unpredictable. Now imagine trying to manage that without training, without oversight, without a framework, just instinct, just reaction, just trying to keep things from falling apart. That's where Larry found himself. Not outside the problem, inside it, trying to navigate something that had already grown beyond what he could fully manage. And this is where the difference between intention and outcome becomes critical. Because intention doesn't stabilize a system. Structure does, and structure was no longer holding. Now consider how this looks to the outside world. Reports, observations, patterns being documented. Not one incident, but many. Repeated, consistent, indicating that the situation is not improving. And once that pattern is clear, the system that watches these situations begins to respond. Not emotionally, procedurally, because it's no longer asking whether the people involved care. It's asking whether the environment is safe. Now here's the key moment. The shift from concern to decision. This doesn't happen publicly. It happens in documentation, in review, in assessment, multiple observations aligning, multiple factors pointing in the same direction. And once that alignment happens, the outcome becomes more likely. Not certain, but moving in that direction. Now think about what that means. The decision is not based on a single failure. It's based on accumulated risk. An accumulated risk is harder to argue against because it doesn't rely on one moment. It relies on a pattern. Now return to Larry. At this point, his role has changed again. He is no longer just managing the house. He is now part of a system being evaluated. His actions, his decisions, his ability to maintain safety, all under scrutiny. Not personal scrutiny, functional scrutiny. Can this environment continue safely under current conditions? And if the answer is uncertain, that uncertainty becomes the deciding factor. Because in situations involving vulnerable individuals, uncertainty is not neutral. It is risk. Now the final stage begins. Preparation, not visible, but active. Because once intervention becomes likely, the system prepares for it. How to proceed, who to involve, how to ensure safety during the process. And when that preparation is complete, action follows. And when it does, it feels sudden, even though it was building the entire time. Now consider the moment itself. People arrive, decisions are communicated, and within a short period of time, the structure of the house changes completely. Not gradually, immediately. And for those inside, it feels like everything is taken at once. Not because of intent, but because of necessity. Because once the decision is made, delay is no longer an option. Now think about Larry in that moment, standing in the same place he always stood, but no longer in control, because control has shifted from the house to the system, and that is the final transformation of his role, from gatekeeper to witness, not because he chose it, but because the situation reached a point where his authority was no longer enough. Now here's the part that lingers, because after the action is taken, after the removal happens, what remains is not resolution. It's absence. The house is still there. The history is still there. But the people he was responsible for are no longer inside it. And that creates a silence that doesn't go away. Because it's not just about what happened. It's about what couldn't be prevented. And that's where this story becomes something deeper than a single event. It becomes a question, not just about Larry, but about responsibility, about limits, about what happens when someone is placed in a role that requires more than they can give. And no one steps in early enough to change that. Because by the time intervention happens, it's already late. Not too late to act, but too late to preserve what was there before. And that's why the ending of this part of the story doesn't feel like closure. It feels like a transition from one kind of instability to another kind of reality. And Larry remains in the middle of it. Not as the man who caused everything, not as the man who fixed it, but as the man who stood there while it changed and could not stop it. Comment below. Do you think situations like this are more about individual failure or about systems not stepping in soon enough? After everything changed, one thing didn't. The house was still there. Same walls, same yard, same place where everything had happened. But it no longer held the same weight, because the people who defined it were gone. And what remained wasn't chaos. It was something quieter, something harder to describe. Absence. For years, that house had meaning because of who was inside it, because of the routines, the responsibility, the constant need to manage, respond, and hold things together. Now that structure was gone, and with it, the role Larry had lived inside for most of his life. That's the part people don't always think about. What happens after responsibility disappears? Not gradually, but all at once. Because when you spend years being needed, being relied on, being part of something that requires you every day, that becomes identity. And when that identity is removed, it leaves a gap. Not a visible one, but a real one. A silence where something used to be. Now consider Larry in that position. Still in the same place. Still surrounded by the same environment. But no longer holding the same role. No longer making the same decisions. No longer carrying the same daily weight. That doesn't feel like relief. It feels like displacement. Because the structure he lived inside is gone. But he hasn't left it. He's still there. Inside the same space. With the same memories. And the same questions. Questions that don't have clear answers. What could have been done differently? What should have been stopped earlier? What part of this was within his control? And what part was already beyond it? Those questions don't resolve. They repeat. Because there's no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. There's only reflection. And reflection, without resolution, becomes something heavier. Now step back and look at the full picture. 3 people removed to structured care. A system stepping in where the house could no longer hold. And one man left behind in the place where it all unfolded. Not as the villain, not as the hero, but as the one who remained. That's why this story doesn't end cleanly. Because it isn't about a single failure. It's about limits. The limits of what one person can manage. The limits of informal care. The limits of a system that waited until the situation reached its breaking point. And the limits of control in a space that slowly stopped being controllable. Now ask yourself something more difficult. If you were placed in that position, without preparation, without support, with everything depending on you, would you have recognized the moment when things started to slip? Would you have closed the door sooner? Would you have pushed people away, even if they were helping? Or would it have looked the same from the inside as it did to him? Normal. Manageable, until it wasn't, because that's the part that matters. Not just what happened, but how easily it could happen again. In another house, with another family, with another person standing in the same position, trying to hold something together, without realizing it's already coming apart. And that's why this story stays with people. Not because it's shocking, but because it's familiar in a way most don't want to admit. It's about responsibility without structure, care without support, and the quiet moment when being there is no longer enough. Comment below. Do you think Larry failed this situation? Or was he placed in a position no one could have managed alone? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.